Starting.
Okay.
Good. Good.
All right.
Sound bad. Connection's good. About 4 more seconds. 3.
Good evening, everyone. And
Good evening.
we begin, as usually, with the prayer. Our Heavenly King, comfort, Spirit of truth, art everywhere present and fills all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity, save our souls, a good one. All right, so God willing, we've got 4 topics tonight. Whether we get through all of the 4 topics, I'm not sure, but we'll try. So the first one is about today's saint and the dedication of the second Sunday of Lent to Saint Gregory Palamas, Archbishop of Thessalonica. Almost said it in Greek then, Thessaloniki. Okay, the second topic is just a little one. Jesus Christ departs from Herod's domain. That's in Mark chapter 6, a couple of verses 30 to 32. The third topic is feeding the 5,000, just a continuation in chapter 6 in Mark. And Jesus walks on water. That's the continuation of that chronology and the story, but we'll read it from Matthew because Matthew gives the most detailed story out of the 4. Okay, so the first topic is about Saint Gregory. So Saint Gregory is born at the end of the 13th century in 1296, and he came from a noble Anatolian family. Now, by Anatolian, Anatolia in Greek means east, so it's Asia Minor. In those times, Asia Minor was, to a large extent, Greek-speaking. Right. So he was attracted to monastic life from an early age, and at the age of 22, he organized a trip with his 2 brothers to the holy mountain, Mount Athos. There was a bit of a, whoa, someone's trying to get in. Yes, okay. I'll just let them in, press the green button. They're probably going to go around to the other door now. We just have a couple of people wanting to tourists. Tourists? All right. My apologies about that. So, yes. So while the 3 brothers are on the holy mountain, the Turks attack. And they have to flee to Thessalonica, where Gregory stays, and he's ordained a priest in the year 1326. Now, in the 30s, he spends a number of years in monastic seclusion in a couple of different places, including Mount Athos again. In 1337, he's involved in a controversy that's a very well-known story because, it received a lot of attention. He's involved in a controversy with a monk from Calabria. Now, in those centuries, Calabria still had a large Greek population. Eventually, these people became assimilated, and southern Italians, to a large extent, assimilated Greeks. So Calabria, he came from Calabria in southern Italy, a monastic, yes, and he was influenced by what was happening in for a couple of centuries in the West in scholastic thought by Western nominalism. Now, Gregory criticized Balaam's rather extreme teaching about God's complete unknowability. Well, as often happens in these controversies, people don't respond honestly, and Balaam just attacked him about the contemplative practices of the hesychasts. This was the 14th century, quite a golden age of the hesychastic life on the mountain, on the holy in Mount Athos. Now, Gregory replied with his best-known work, known as Triads in Defense of the Holy Hesychasts, which was published in 1338. Now, by publish, it means he made it public, through people copying things by hand. That's how they used to publish books then. His orthodoxy, the orthodoxy of his teaching was affirmed at two synods conducted at Constantinople, the first in 1347 and the second in 1351. In 1347, he was actually ordained Archbishop of Thessalonica. He, again, wasn't immediately able to get to his see because of Turkish incursions, but eventually he got there, and he served as a wonderful archpastor, a preacher, actually around between 160 and 170 of his homilies recorded by various people, his students, disciples, have survived. So that's and published, available today. So really high level sermons, homilies. They cover both pastoral and theological aspects. All right, now in theology, St. Gregory stressed the biblical image of man as body and soul together, a continuum. What had happened in the West in those earlier centuries was a process where the concept of antiquity, about this divide between this physical world and the spiritual world, crept into Western Christianity, and from there into the beginnings of modern science. So this is why science decided that it would not look at things that have anything to do with spirituality, and that science would leave that to theology, which may or may not be good. But that's another big topic. Now, so because we human beings are a union of heaven and earth, I always like to refer to the first page, the first words of the Bible in Genesis, where it says, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. And if you follow the flow of the story of creation, heaven and earth come together in Adam. So, Adam is heaven and earth together, the spiritual and the physical, the material. Right. Now, the hesychasts, may better explain what this word hesychast means. Comes from the Greek word issυχία, which means stillness or silence. It's more about stillness, not necessarily physical silence. You don't have to have physical silence in the manner of some of the Western contemplative orders that, promise not to speak at all. But it's about having calm at sea inside the heart, calm from the passions. Right, now the hesychasts, through physical and spiritual exercises, achieve the vision of the uncreated light, which they perceive with their physical eyes, just like the holy apostles Peter, James, and John did so with their physical eyes when they saw Christ transfigured on Mount Tabor. Really impressed by a story in Jordanville. One of the monks has now passed away in recent years, Father Joe, who as a little boy saw two monks during the times of the persecutions in the Soviet Union, who secretly came to their home at night, and he saw them praying in a separate room. He accidentally sort of opened the door. So he saw a light. And while they were praying, they were aglow with this light. So this is the light of which Saint Gregory speaks, the uncreated light, uncreated energies of God, the light of Holy Transfiguration. He had an interesting attitude to philosophy, St. Gregory, and now contrary to Balaam, who together with the scholastic theologians spoke about the unity of knowledge of the pagans and the Christians. That was basically the same sort of knowledge. And that philosophy and theology could give the same knowledge. His view was that these are two radically different ways of knowledge. So, firstly, natural reason can be used to gain a knowledge of the material world. But natural reason cannot give us any knowledge about our salvation. And secondly, you have the vision that opens up to the purified spiritual mind. It's even better to use the Greek word nous, or the Slavic word which means, it doesn't mean intellect. There's a huge difference between the intellect and the spiritual mind, which is like an eye. It doesn't reason, it sees. I mean, it can reason, but it even in its reasoning, it sees directly. So this is a vision that is given to the mind, to the spiritual mind, enlightened by the grace of God. St. Gregory often said that philosophy is a zone of great danger in which only the best can succeed. He didn't, he was a very educated man. It wasn't like he he threw away philosophy because he didn't know about it or didn't understand it. He did very well, indeed. But his main interest was in higher levels of knowledge. So here's a quote from him about philosophy. He writes, snakes are useful to us too. But first, they have to be killed, dissected, and an antidote prepared from the venom, which can be helpful against their bites. Apply that to philosophy. All right. Okay, this comes from one of his triads. So, in this respect, he narrowed the application of philosophy to the point of anti-pagan apologetics. All right. Despite the fact that Constantinopolitan sinners, two of them that I quoted in the 14th century, upheld the orthodoxy of his writings. His writings were attacked, interestingly enough, in the 20th century. The controversy hasn't gone away. This controversy of East and West. Now, there in the 14th century was Balaam, who was ostensibly an Orthodox monk from Calabria, but influenced by the scholastics. Here we have in the 1970s a number of Roman Catholic theologians who attacked Palamism as a dangerous radical innovation. The Orthodox response came from a number of Orthodox authors. Barrois or Barrois, I'm not sure how, that's certainly a French-looking surname, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Ware, of course, it's Callistus Ware. And a couple of others. So they said that the teaching of St. Gregory is a summation of a tradition going back centuries and even millennia. Really, it goes back to Moses. So Gregory teaches about a distinction between the essence and energies in God. And there's a long prehistory of this teaching. So let me just say that according to St. Gregory, the essence of God, that's the deepest part of God, cannot be known by human beings all. In this sense, this is the transcendental God. But what the ancient philosophers couldn't understand is how this transcendental God would have anything to do with the created world. Well, the centuries-long tradition of Christianity tells us that God interacts with the world through his energies. Well, the word energies is a term introduced by St. Gregory. But writers like St. Gregory, the theologian, Bishop of Nazianzus, makes a distinction between the face of God and his back. Now that comes up in the story of Moses at the summit of Mount Sinai, when God said to him, no one can see my face and live. By face, God meant his essence. You can only see my back. So I can show you through my energies. So I can attempt a very primitive approximation to this. Here we are. I'm talking at the moment, and some people are listening to me, and you can also see me. But it's not really me, my essence. What you are hearing and seeing are energies, first of all, of my voice that is picked up by this microphone here and first coded and decoded and turned into sound again, waves that are formed by the speakers your end and come through the air and hit your eardrums, and you hear my voice. So that's all energies. Same with the vision, the image. So light in here in this church is reflected of my face and my hands and so on, and picked up by the camera and coded, sent across, decoded, and picked up by the light, your retina, your lens in the eyes and the retina and then the optic nerve and to the brain is decoded by the brain, etc. So you see, it's all a pathway of energies. So we can use this as an image of how we can perceive God, because He speaks to us through a similar pattern of using His energies. And some of them can be visible and audible. Right. And so that's not the face of God, but His back. Not the essence, which is unknowable, but His energies. Okay, so we've got to keep track of time. Similar expressions and a distinction between these two realities of God are present in the writings of a man whom we call the father of orthodoxy. Wow, what a title. That's Saint Athanasius the Great, Archbishop of Alexandria in Egypt. He talks about that, and Saint Basil the Great, and also the younger brother of Saint Basil, Saint Gregory, Bishop of Nyssa. Somewhat later, because these are all in the second half of the 4th century, but someone from the 7th century, Saint Maximus the Confessor, talks about the logi of the mind of God. Okay, now that I can't go into a detailed explanation of what he's talking about, but again, this is a distinction. The logi is plural of logos, word. So it's like the talking about the thoughts of God that can be conducted and expressed and perceived. Right. Now, the traditional Orthodox teaching is that God cannot be known by any effort of His creatures. We can, turn inside out, do all sorts of mental gymnastics. It's not going to help. Our intellect is not going to help. We can only know God when He chooses to reveal Himself through His energies. Okay, it's His choice. He reveals Himself to those who are ready for this communication, this revelation. And this revelation and communication happens according to the maturity and the abilities of those people to whom it's addressed. Okay, so that's a little bit about St. Gregory and some theology there. So now we open the Gospel of Mark at chapter 6, verses 30 to 32. So let's read that. Right, 30, 32, 32. Wow. Then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. So this is when they come back after their mission, as you know, they're sent out on the mission. We covered that last time. And he said to them, "Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves." Right. So the synoptics, and I remind you constantly when those that have possibly come on board just recently, when I say the synoptics, I mean Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the first three. The synoptics connect Christ's departure to the eastern shores of Lake Galilee, or the Sea of Galilee, with three things. First of all, the death, the news of the death of John the Baptist. Secondly, the return of the 12 from their mission, for whom Christ sought to provide some rest, and also for himself, because he'd been, just constantly badgered by big crowds. And thirdly, these opinions at the court of Herod Antipas, that Jesus was John the Baptist risen from the dead, and Herod's curiosity and desire to see him. These are all the reasons why Christ wants to just get away from all of this. So the eastern shores of this big lake were controlled by Antipas's brother, Philip, whose wife he had stolen. And Philip seems to be the only decent son of Herod the Great, because he left some good memories from the time of his rule among the people. Now, the deserted place where Christ sought to have a break with his disciples was, according to Luke now, we just read from Mark, was near Bethsaida, which, when considered, would be an indication that they went to the eastern shores, means that this was the second Bethsaida, which was named Julia by Philip in honor of the emperor's daughter, Emperor Augustus. Now, Augustus Caesar was the emperor during whose reign Christ was born. His name was Octavian, but he adopted another name, Augustus. So Octavian had a daughter named Julia, and Philip named this town Julia. Right, so that's where it was. So let's read on from Mark about the feeding of the 5,000. So that's verses 33 to 44, just continuing on. Right. But the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. They arrived before them and came together to him. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. When the day was now fast spent, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away that they may go into the surrounding country, villages, and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat." But he answered and said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" But he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks, in hundreds and in 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. So they all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. And those who had eaten of the loaves were about 5,000 men. So this is a very important story as we progress, and we'll only cover the more kind of superficial part of the story tonight. And next time we'll talk about the explanation of all these things by Christ himself, when he comes the next morning to the synagogue at Capernaum. All right, so the story is told by all 4 evangelists, and there is agreement among them about, the progression, the facts, but each one of them brings different little details to the story, little specifics. So Matthew, for instance, says that there were 5,000 men besides women and children. That can be understood in 2 ways. Women and children didn't matter much in those days. Possibly you could say that, which sounds awful, but I think it's not that at all. That's not the reason why the evangelist writes this way, but it's because in those days people thought not in terms of individuals, but in terms of families. Everyone belonged to a family. So there were 5,000 families. That's what he's talking about. Okay. Men certainly were heads of the families in those days. Maybe not today, but in those days they were. All right. Okay, secondly, Mark and Luke point out the manner that Jesus Christ instructed the people to sit down in groups of 50 and 100 people on the grass. So that's an interesting connection there to, first of all, the story of Exodus and the manner in which the camp was organized very methodically, and kind of a structured way. Secondly, it's a pointer in the direction of the church that was to come. So these groups of 50 and 100 represent church bodies like parishes, church families. Okay, so these people there were families. They're sitting together in larger families of the church, parishes, and later on, monasteries. Monasteries are a monastic family as well. There's an obvious Eucharistic connection here, with the multiplication of the loaves. And we'll see that next time when we begin to look at Christ's speech, where he explained about himself as the bread from heaven. And that image of feeding the 5,000 was an image of the Eucharist. Now, John, who, remember, wrote much later than the Synoptics, points out that this, and he, for that reason, he tends to add and to complement the information that the Synoptics present. And he sometimes adds very important and critical little elements, sometimes not little, but in big things. So in this case, he points out that this was close to the Passover, right? He also mentions that the loaves and the fishes that were sourced from a boy, a lad in the crowd. Right, John's indication of the timing in this chapter 6 clearly parallels the story of the first Passover, celebrated at the time of Exodus from Egypt. Because what we had was the people, the Israelites in Egypt, they saw all of these signs of Moses, through Moses, and then they left. Here, we just read a reference to the fact that people saw all these signs that Jesus performed, the healings and so on the western shores of the lake, and they ran after him. They followed him. So it's like they're following him, like the Israelites followed Moses. Right. Now, a lot of those people were pilgrims who had come. They were on the way to Jerusalem for the Passover. So there were big crowds. The local population was boosted by hundreds and thousands of people from overseas, from across the border, in Syria, so on, modern Iraq. Maybe some of them came by ship and landed in the ports on the Mediterranean coast and then worked their way through Galilee and down to Jerusalem by foot. So they follow Jesus. Now, there's also a parallel between manna in the wilderness, right, and bread provided by Christ to feed these people who came with no provisions. They were there all day and they got hungry. In the second half of chapter 6, Christ himself makes this connection between food and drink and himself. Just as Moses provided water and manna from God in the wilderness. But that's something that we're going to talk about in detail next time, not tonight. So anyway, the Lord was hoping to take his disciples away from the crowds on the western shore and have a rest himself there was no rest for them because the crowds follow them. And he had pity on them, as we heard, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. That's a very touching image. And he was certainly a loving shepherd. And I am the good shepherd, he says later on in John's Gospel. And so he looked after them, he healed them, he gave them nourishment for the soul. But eventually, you know, they were physical beings as well, and they got hungry, the poor things. So he cared for them and turned to the disciples, you know, and pointed out that they needed to be fed. So in John, John leaves out these details mentioned by the synoptics. He goes straight into the story. It's factual, spiritual, symbolic aspects. Now, in John, Christ asks Philip, I'll just read from John, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? But this he said to test him, to test Philip, for he himself knew what he would do. And Philip responds and says, 200 denarii would not be enough to feed this crowd. So it seems that this was the sum that the apostles had in their kitty. So the money that they had would not be enough to feed this huge crowd, not of 5,000 people, but 5,000 families. Now, in John, we read that Andrew finds the boy, possibly he was a small-time peddler who, you know, sold a few things, and he happened to have these 5 loaves and 2 fishes. All right, so now let's turn to the next story, and that's Jesus walks on water. However, we won't continue reading in Mark, which, you know, Mark certainly has that too. But as I said, the most detailed story is in Matthew. So in Matthew, we need to look at chapter 14, from verse 22 to 33. Okay, Matthew chapter 14, 22 to 33. All right. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. But while he sent the multitudes away, and when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now, when evening came, he was alone there, but the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Okay, so that's the extent of our readings tonight. Now we'll just comment on this last story. Right, we've got about 16 minutes. Now, the reason why immediately after this incredible and wonderful miracle of the loaves, Christ sent his disciples away and departed himself from these crowds is explained in John. And we can understand that what happened was that the miracle, when the bread and the fishes, this food was multiplied, it, to these hungry people, it created such excitement that they saw Jesus as the fulfillment of their dreams and aspirations, and that here he was, the great prophet of whom Moses had spoken, the Messiah, and they were ready to take hold of him and march on to Jerusalem. You have to also keep in mind that his own disciples were not immune from these dreams. They shared the aspirations of all the Israelites about this earthly Messiah. So this is why he sends his disciples away. He just leaves the crowd and goes up to the mountain to pray. Right. Now, so Christ did this to minimize and just diffuse the risk of unnecessary political upheaval. Can you imagine this procession marching on to Jerusalem with the Messiah at their head? All right. This was going to happen, but a year later, when Christ comes to Jerusalem and he enters on Palm Sunday, as we know it now, after the raising of Lazarus. The apostles were instructed to cross the lake to its western shores around Capernaum. But a strong northeasterly was blowing, made it very difficult to achieve that, and they were being driven towards the southwest. And in the fourth watch of the night, now the division of day and night into watches of 3 hours was very convenient because there was a changing of the guard. And in the times when you had no clocks, no way to tell the time, this is how people could tell roughly what the time was. So yes, the fourth watch of the night was from 3 to 6 a.m. It's the part of the night. From 6 a.m. you have the first morning watch. So our Christian hours are connected with those early times of the watches, the changing of the guard. So Christ appears. The apostles are already terrified of this storm, and I think when we're discussing the first storm, when Christ was with them and he was sleeping on the boat, completely ignoring the storm. At that time, I looked up how big waves can get on this lake, and they can be quite sizable, over 2 meters. And, that's for a small boat. 2-meter waves are quite scary. Right, and we're not talking about a 2-meter swell in the ocean where you're going to have a 3-meter, 4-meter swell. It looks scary, but it's not dangerous. But we're talking about wind waves, chop, as it's known to sailors, and they're really unpleasant. A 2-meter chop, God forbid. So they see him, they're terrified, and he speaks to them and he says, "It is I." And in actual fact, he said the divine name that he gave to Moses at the burning bush. He said basically the sacred name, I am. I am Yahweh. Yes, as I explained, was it last time? About the cruciform halo of Christ with the Greek word, the article, on. I am. I am being. I'm the one who exists, who is being. Okay, not very easy to translate that word. So only Matthew gives the story of Peter walking on water, and this is why, of course, I read it. The other disciples don't give that the story of Peter. I guess Peter himself, who was supplying all the information to Mark. So in Mark's gospel, you know, we do not come across that story. I guess Peter didn't want mention that, you know, he actually walked on water, even though it was a fiasco. But still. So what happens to Peter is, first of all, he has faith and focus on Christ. And so he begins walking on the water, and then he loses that focus, and the wind and the waves get him to sort of focus, turn his focus away from Christ, and he gets scared and starts drowning. All right, so the boat is recognized as a symbol of the church. Now, in the writings of Christian commentators, writers from the earliest times, a boat symbolized the church. The first symbol, of course, is Noah's Ark with the animals. It's a symbol of, you know, the church of all the nations. Okay. But afterwards, St. John Chrysostom, in one of his sermons, actually, has a beautiful image of the boat on which Christ is the captain. And he goes into details and speaks about the Holy Spirit as the wind that blows and fills the sail, makes the boat move. Right, so the boat being a symbol of the church, in this story, it certainly communicates to us that it's safer to stay within the confines of the boat rather than to try a little solo excursion walking on water. They're quite dangerous, not a good idea to try and walk solo out of the boat on the storms of life. And the story finishes with the apostles, says they worshipped him. For the first time, they acknowledged him as the Son of God. Well, that's significant. All right. So that's the end of our talk tonight. No? Have we got some questions?
Okay.
All right.
Which English word comes close to the word nous?
Which is a word, that is close to it.
Yeah.
Well, okay, in English it's spelled N-O-U-S. In Greek it's pronounced nous. Okay, sometimes in English you say nous. Okay, now nous is the spirit or the mind of the soul. It's our teacher in dogmatic theology, Father Michael Tomaszanski in Jordanville, used to say that think of the nous or the spirit as the brain of the soul. It's the highest part of the soul. And that explains, he says also, this is how we can reconcile two ways of talking about the human being. First of all, that we're in two parts. Okay, we're heaven and earth, as I said tonight. So the body and soul. But as well as that, we are tripartite. We have three parts: body, soul, and spirit. But spirit is actually a part of the soul. It's like, the brain is the command center of our body, right? In this way, the human spirit, or nous, is the highest part of the soul. It's the brain of the soul. But it is different to the intellect, because the word intellect is a reference to the way that the intellect works. Now, the intellect is a function of the brain. It works just like a computer. It's 0101. Okay, it's about a kind of a conversation that happens inside. It's deductive thinking, deductive patterns. That's what intellect is. But nous, Christ, in the Sermon on the Mount, which we've studied, and I did mention that, I'm sure there, that he talks about the I, and that I is precisely our spirit, or nous, the mind of the soul, the brain of the soul. Okay, good.
How did they choose the Sundays of Great Lent?
How many?
How did they choose them?
How did they choose them?
How did they get chosen?
All right. Look, the liturgical patterns and traditions developed slowly, and they changed many times. So, as you can see, well, today, this Sunday, the church, celebrates the memory of Saint Gregory Palamas. Now, before the 14th century, there was no Gregory Palamas, so the church didn't have that. And you see, actually, by the 14th century, most of the liturgical structures that we use today were already in place. So this is one of the later additions. Okay, now, a thing like, for instance, the first Sunday of Lent, it's last Sunday, Sunday of Orthodoxy. Well, that goes back to the year 842, as I mentioned last Sunday. And that had to do with the complete triumph of the icon veneration. After two periods of iconoclasm from above, icon veneration was reestablished and sort of set in concrete, with a requirement that the church celebrates this occasion every year at the same time when it happened then, in the year 842, the first Sunday of Lent. So that's how that came into being. So you got 9th century thing here, we got a 14th century there with Saint Gregory. He was canonized very quickly after his death, and his disciple and the future patriarch, Philotheus, popularized his teaching and so on. So, right. The next Sunday of a Great Lent will be the Sunday of the Holy Cross. Okay, so, well, the Holy Cross, of course, became very important when, from the time of Queen Empress Helen and her son, Constantine, when she found the precious cross of Christ in Jerusalem. And when the huge temple, the church of the Holy Sepulchre was built by her, completed in the year 330. So the feast of the Holy Cross came into being. That's the 14th of September. Add 13 days for old calendar, the 27th. 14th according to the Julian calendar. But the usual rationale for having a celebration of the Holy Cross on this middle Sunday of Lent, the third Sunday of Lent, is that it is sort of the high point. It's the apex of Lent. You know, it's a kind of an encouragement for us to see where we're going. We're going towards Golgotha. We're going towards Christ's passion, his crucifixion and resurrection. So it's to encourage us. Okay.
The 5,000, did the 5,000 feeding, did he multiply the bread and loaf to be 5,000, or did he just break it up to be enough and it just kept?
Well, as we can see from the text, there were 12 large baskets left over. So that's the abundance of it, you know. The whole lot was fed, and there was still food left over.
The 5,000 families must have been interesting because that is larger than Herod's average army. So
larger than
Herod's armies were not that big.
No, of course not.
So that must have been very concerning for him.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, that's right. This is why the Lord was concerned about defusing this whole excitement. Can you imagine so many thousands of people getting all hyped up? Wow, we got the Messiah. We're going to march on Jerusalem now, you know.
So he really wanted to refuse his crucifixion. He absolutely could have with the people. They would have happily fought for him.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
We're done.
Done. Fantastic. Well, it's just past 8 o'clock. Let's just quickly say the prayer. And so, yes, before we leave, a reminder that we, God willing, meet again next Sunday, Sunday of the Holy Cross. And we'll certainly talk about the cross a little bit then, and then continue like we did tonight with a little bit of the gospel study.
And we have space here too.
And we have space here. I didn't notice whether Costa reminded people in his email, but it doesn't seem to work. So what can you do? But on the other hand, people are watching it, and I'm very encouraged to see how many people actually watch the recordings of this. Well, doxa to Theo, as they say in Greek, which means glory be to God. Okay. It is truly meet to bless the Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, beyond compare, more glorious than the seraphim. Without corruption, thou gavest birth to God, the word, true Theotokos, thee that we magnify. Thank you all, and see you on the same channel next Sunday. God bless you.